This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
The Whole Foodie Festival is on at Whole Foods Market through October 3rd, where you can save on hundreds of culinary favorites: cheese, crackers, charcuterie, olives and chocolates, plus short ribs, caviar, and produce, all on sale. Plus, you'll save on a large selection of wine, including those made with organically grown grapes, starting at just $6.99. Whole Foods also offers the type of specialty items you just can't find in most supermarkets, from specialty flours and mixes to a large selection of international foods and a wide selection of fresh produce, fish, and meat. Whether you're looking for spritzers, vegan offerings, or just enjoy being in a supermarket that really cares, Whole Foods is the place to be. Check out the Whole Foodie Festival today.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Sheila Dillon, and in this edition of the food programme, producer Sophie Anton and I are trying to find out if a more localised, regionalised food system is possible. What changes are necessary if we're going to break away from the globalised food chains, so good at producing food that's cheap at the till, but so costly in other ways? We hope it gets you thinking. What does buying local mean to you when it comes to food? Buying from your local veg box scheme, visiting a local farm shop, or seeking out anything produced in the UK when you're at the supermarket? Do you care? Does it matter? The local food movement was born out of the success of supermarkets, with their global supply chains coming to dominate food sales. The majority of local food shops disappeared. But the values of localism didn't, and got a big boost during COVID as supermarket shelves emptied, shops, street markets and co-ops that were reliant on what was sourced locally thrived.
So it's about environmental sustainability, but also about fairness in the food system. That is a critical difference. Key beneficiaries are the consumers, getting great produce, freshly picked, fairly traded as well. You've also got the farmers who can stay organic, stay in business, because they know this market is here.
So have those COVID successes bedded down in our food system? Does localism matter as supermarket chains battle to sell us the cheapest? Well, today we talked to some of the players in the UK, including our 3 producer finalists in the BBC Food and Farming Awards, and hear how localism's doing in a country that set the hypermarket model, the USA.
I think that in this new era, what you need is not globalization, but regionalization and localization. You need to be able to make things, you need to be able to service things, you need to be able to farm things. That change is definitely occurring. And I will say that in the Biden administration, there are more and more people in power that believe we need to see change in how we think about economics and policy making. So I'm hopeful for the future.
We've come to the old fire station headquarters of Growing Communities, a local food network in Hackney, East London. Since 1996, they've run a veg box scheme and farmers market, building up what they call an agro-ecological supply chain around East London. Vicky Hurd, head of farming at Sustain, that's an alliance of groups campaigning for better food and farming, met us there.
Well, we're standing in the packing hall and all the onions and leeks and damsons and everything are being packed. Can you take us through the ebbs and flows and popularity of local food in the UK over the last few decades?
I first started working on this in the mid-90s. We were talking about the Food Marvels report. And back then there was a massive increase in interest, and we had loads more farmers markets starting as a result. And we had a Making Local Food work during the noughties, which was about really celebrating local food systems, mapping them as well. Where are they? But ultimately it didn't tackle the systemic problems like planning, like taxation. And then it didn't really tackle the unfairness in the system, which leads to supermarkets getting larger and larger market share. So it's been very difficult. I think during the 90s and noughties, they grew and grew. In the last 10 years, there's been a problem because finding things like space to have a hub and market, all been difficult. Local authorities struggling with supporting these kind of things. COVID actually celebrated local food. A lot of people rediscovered local food and local food traders, which was brilliant. But then the Ukraine war put a big problem with the cost of living. And when some of these products are higher priced, because they've come from a system which is different in style. It needs more people working on it, so it costs more. The whole way in which we do food in this country is skewed towards pile it high, sell it cheap, and that's ultimately got to change.
More from Vicky Hurd and growing communities later. The first of our 3 food producer finalists makes sheep's milk cheese at her cousin Cymru Dairy near Bethesda in North Wales using local milk. Until a few years ago, Carrie Rhymes was a senior civil servant.
When my son left home, I knew I had to do something a little bit different. I'd been a single parent and, it was quite a traumatic event, him leaving home. So I thought, right, this is absolutely the time. If I'm going to do something different, it's now. I've always had a bit of a thing about cheese. I took early severance, I retrained. I went out to France with a woofing scheme. It was about 3 years all in all on small farms, and this was the best. I mean, seeing it work. And practically everything was sold locally at local markets. There was a great cooperation between different producers.
You were getting on for 60 when you started your new life as a cheesemaker.
Yes, it was, well into my 50s anyway. So yeah, I'm now in the situation where the majority of my friends are retiring, and I haven't really properly started yet, so... yeah.
That's the story we all want to hear, right?
When I came back from France back in 2014, and I really wanted to make sheep's milk cheese, then, there was nobody here in North Wales milking sheep at all. I really felt that this was the way to go. I mean, if Wales couldn't make, sheep dairy products, it just seemed a nonsense. So, Alan Paddy Johns from Quilog was the first one to sort of phone me up and say, oh, yeah, I'd be quite interested in milking some sheep. 2 young farmers on Ynys Môn, on Anglesey, who are now milking for me. So, yeah, we have quite a cooperative thing going between the farmers and myself making cheese.
Carrie's cheese is outstanding. The soft Brevi Bach and 2 hard cheeses, and her yoghurt is up there with the best. All are made in a brand new dairy converted from a 1960s Roman Catholic church with the help of a grant from the Welsh Government. The dairy is fronted by a shop selling Carrie's cheese, of course, and a lot of other foods produced nearby.
Yes, I was very, very lucky to have quite a substantial food business investment scheme grant from the Welsh Government, which, well, no two ways about it. I would not have been able to have done this without that. We've worked quite closely with, for instance, Pandy Farm and their various salads and vegetables. We've got Sheena and Tyfireri and her lovely microgreens. We've got Colette, and she makes a wonderful selection of lemon curds and chutneys and pickles and cordials. All in all, it's quite healthy and growing and, hopefully for the future.
Yeah, I'm Colette Price and I live nearby. I think, like many of the local producers, would perhaps sell at the market once a month, but having a permanent place to sell things and a focus in this shop here has made a really big difference. And people growing their own food and knowing where their food's come from is really so important, isn't it? But hopefully trying to spread that message at a price that people can afford, because that's the problem. The food in this shop is probably too expensive for a lot of people. If you're a small producer, you can't sell as cheaply as the big producers, but you can produce better food.
What is it that draws you into this little shop to buy yoghurt?
I'm just really enthusiastic about buying local products and something that's organic.
We were talking before you arrived about the fact that there are many people who can't afford to buy the food that's on sale here. If you're setting up a local food system, that's a big drawback, isn't it?
I'm on a very low income. For me, food is something I value in my life. There's plenty of other things I could spend my money on, but I choose to spend my money on high quality food.
There's always this conversation that somehow food like this is elitist. Does it in part come down to the value that you put on food?
Absolutely. As a nation, I don't think we value food at all. I'd much rather occasionally spend a larger amount of money on something really good quality. I don't eat organic used milk yogurt every day, but maybe I get that every couple of weeks, and then for me it's really valuable.
A local customer of cheesemaker Carrie Rhymes, who's grappling with one of the hardest conundrums faced by small local producers as they develop their businesses, setting a price her local customers can afford while paying her suppliers fairly. Let's go back to growing communities in East London, where 1,750 veg boxes are mid-pack.
Leeks from two suppliers, one of our main ones down in Kent. So carrots are all coming from Bagthorpe.
Onions are coming from where?
They have a patchwork network of their own growing sites in London, close connections with farmers in Kent and Essex, and then producers more widely spread, a model they call food zones. They start sourcing as close as possible to their HQ, then work outwards, sourcing from farmers according to what they've got and what makes sense at different times of the year. The network is growing, made possible by the Better Food Shed, a wholesaler committed to paying farmers fairly. Julie Brown is the director and founder of Growing Communities.
In order to trade with our farmers, we need to pay them a fair price for their produce. So we start with that as our baseline of the economic models. And we then put our markup on it, we pay ourselves living wages, and then we pass that produce on to our customers. So that economic loop is quite a tricky one to balance. We managed to cut out a lot of the costs because it is local. And so some of the distribution costs are less and we don't have waste. Yeah, but we're still here, we're still doing it, and we're still managing after 25 years to do that.
People, to a great degree, are focused much more on what they can buy for the small amount of money they have. How does localism ride that?
With great difficulty. It is an enormous challenge. I mean, a project that Growing Communities is involved in at the moment called Bridging the Gap is looking at how it might be possible to get climate and nature-friendly food specifically to people on lower incomes. But that programme isn't going to be able to solve it real-time now. It's going to have to gather evidence from those trials in order to put pressure on government and local authorities for policy change. We need money to be going into different parts of the system for this to work. There's only so much that people who can afford to buy this food can do to drive this system. We have to get national and local government on board with this, and they need to understand that if they want local and climate-friendly supply chains to be supplying the people in their areas, they need to actively step up and support this. In practical terms, if we're thinking about the shed, for instance, at the moment we're looking for a new premises for the shed. The model is working in an economic sense, but we need a local authority who's going to give us a social value rent. We can pay money, but we can't pay the full cost. We could pay the full cost, but that would mean we'd have to put the prices up. We're juggling this equation. So if the local authority would come in and say, no, we get that, to give us, support with the infrastructure and the distribution systems, but also to start buying from us. We're operating at a scale now where we could be selling into schools, we could be looking into other sort of avenues of procurement. We just need local authorities to step up and support that.
Julie Brown of Growing Communities. The United States of America began not that long ago as a nation of small farmers. But since the Reagan-Thatcher years brought in a new era of globalization in the 80s, mixed farms, family farms, have gone out of business on a scale never seen before. Those farms that remained vastly increased in size, and what they produced was usually contracted to one of the global commodity companies. Now each major farming sector is dominated by a few of those companies. It's a highly efficient system, making food cheaper and cheaper at the till, but with costs beyond the till price that haven't been counted until recently.
So I think what's happened is we got too much of a good thing. And, this so often happens in economics. And I see again and again, if you go back in history, things sort of work until they don't, right? Pendulums swing and they always reach sort of an apex and then they swing back the other direction.
Rana Foroohar is associate editor and global business columnist at the Financial Times. In a recent Financial Times film, she made the case for how neoliberal economic thinking has broken food supply chains. I asked her why she believed the economic pendulum is swinging back the other way.
When the pandemic hit, you began to see people, because they couldn't get what they needed from large producers and grocery stores, you saw them going local. So community food co-ops were thriving. Small and mid-sized farmers that were sort of rooted in communities were suddenly, they couldn't keep up with demand. And so I think that added fuel to something that was already happening in the States, which was a sense that you need more balanced communities. There's a sense, and this is statistically true, that over the last 20 or 30 years, as globalization has become really turbocharged, you've had a handful of large companies in each sector that have really benefited. And that's given us a lot of cheap stuff, but it's also taken a tremendous amount of jobs. It's taken away things like food security. It's taken away the diversity of economics of individual communities. And I think now there's this sense of, gosh, maybe in diversity, there's resilience. Maybe there's growth. Maybe we need a better balance of production and consumption. In a new world, maybe we need to go much more local as a way of increasing community resilience, but also reducing emissions.
Tell me more about what action he's taken and how significant you think that is.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I think this president is really quite revolutionary in a way that most people globally, but even in America, don't understand yet. So if I were to look at a kind of a crucial turning point, in July of 2021, the president gave a speech where he said, you know what? We're not just a nation of consumers. We're a nation of citizens. We need a mix, not just of big companies, but smaller companies, manufacturing, services. We need to lift up individual people and communities, not just enrich a handful of companies. And he went further and said, trickle-down economics is over. And when you say trickle-down economics, really you're referring to the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, this idea that as long as prices are going down for consumers and share prices are going up for companies, no problem, we're done here, everything's good. But I think now we're starting to see a sea change, and it's being driven by, I believe, populism on both the right and the left, not just in the US, but in Europe. So, for example, one of the things that makes me feel particularly optimistic is that in some of Joe Biden's signature legislation, Build Back Better, infrastructure plans, you're seeing subsidies start to go to small and mid-sized businesses in highly concentrated industries like the food industry, like poultry and meat production is another, grain. You're seeing money go to support small and mid-sized businesses to help them find those local markets and be able to distribute and bring in buyers. It's going to help disrupt this system and hopefully re-empower individuals and re-empower communities.
The Financial Times' Rana Foroohar. Back in the UK, we're in Dorset at our next food producer finalist. Brothers Josh and Dan Benson run one of the oldest blueberry plantations in the UK. They took over the business 9 years ago. Locals do the fruit picking, distributed to nearby businesses and wholesale markets. In summer, they're open for pick your own and sell flowers from their flower garden. Plus, they have a great cafe, extending the blueberry season by selling frozen fruit and homemade jam. We arrived in the heavy rain and took shelter with Josh in the covered part of the plantation.
Mr. Trehane, who established the place, took up an ad in a horticultural magazine. For anyone that wanted to trial growing blueberries, they could do so just for the cost of the shipping from the Lulu Islands in Nova Scotia. He took up the ad and planted 80 plants in 1951, just up the road, and they did absolutely brilliantly. So then over the next decades, he started planting up more and more land, and the plants that we're harvesting off are still the same original plants that he planted back then.
These lines of bushes which go off into the distance, row 24 Blue Ray, row 25 Ivanhoe.
We have 8 different varieties here. Some of these varieties you wouldn't find anywhere else now, or you'd be very hard pushed to find them. Society kind of demands a big blueberry, and in order to make a big blueberry, the flavour starts to get lost.
Blueberries are something that are always in the supermarket. My experience is they're not very tasty, usually, but they come from around the globe as the seasons pass. How do you compete with that kind of business?
We're a small grower in this grand scheme of things. We probably pick and harvest, for commercial reasons, maybe 6 tons of blueberries a year. In the grand scheme of things, it's tiny, and supermarkets, they require quantities that we would never be able to fulfill. The people that we sell to are wholesalers who tend to deal with the farm shops, the upmarket restaurants. So it's great to see more and more British blueberries in the supermarkets because, you can see them this time of year from all over the world. And these are the guys who are able to supply blueberries to the masses. And we do need that, The 2 hardest things I think we found with growing blueberries is transport of getting your blueberries from A to B, and 2, marketing your produce. Thankfully, because we're a small organic grower down in Dorset, and we have regular customers, we don't have to worry too much about marketing. The good thing with Pick Your Own, though, if half your field gets picked by other people and they're having a great time and they're paying you for the privilege of doing it, and they're getting a bargain because it's cheaper than buying it, and it's as fresh as it can possibly be. So there's a good thing in Pick Your Own.
Josh Benson of Brothers Farm, a family company that's found a way of making their small fruit-growing business resilient in a blueberry market dominated by global traders. Having steady customers paying prices that cover the cost of production is essential for smaller producers who don't have the volume to sell to big supermarkets. One retailer championing local, though, is Booth's Supermarkets. They have 27 large stores in Lancashire, Cumbria, Cheshire and Yorkshire, and they estimate that 55% of what they sell is local to them.
In search of quality and also in search of producers who can supply the business at the scale we need them to, it's absolutely essential that we work with businesses who are generally smaller and more locally based. We've got some absolutely incredible food producers in the landscape that we serve. You know, through different times of the year, we'll have potatoes in our stores that were literally in the ground that morning, or we'll have strawberries in the store that were literally on the stalk that morning. So the proximity of those supply chains between getting it literally from field to fork are really, really important. There's this kind of ecosystem that surrounds these stores where everybody benefits from selling local produce because they're knocking on into supporting, you know, other service providers, you know, paying local taxes, etc., etc. So it's massively important, not just from the product that people are buying, but what that's doing to support their local communities and economies.
So do you have a policy with very small producers, or I mean, do you even work with very small producers, of them supplying a group of your stores near them?
Yeah, absolutely. Even down to a single store, if that's what is right for us and right for that supplier. So we can do that. Equally, we can work with smaller producers who have the capability to go into all 27 stores. And that is largely dependent on where that supplier is within their own growth journey.
Now, you come from a background of working in one of the biggest supermarkets in the UK. What part does localism play in a big supermarket, and what part could it play? Because you're saying, you know, you've got 27 stores and you can do small supplier for 3 or 1 or 10. I mean, couldn't they do that, or do they do that?
So I was Asda back in the 2000s, and even then the approach to local was very, very high on the agenda. I think Waitrose are another business who have recently done a lot of work in this area. So I think it can be done. Do I think it's done broadly across the retail landscape? No, I don't. And I think one of the biggest conundrums we've got at the moment is how you square a small, tight, local, kind of near-state supply chain who generally will be focused on producing a very good quality product. It will not be the cheapest. They often do that in a very sustainable way. And how do you square that with selling that product at a price that is accessible by the mass of customers? I think that's one of the greatest challenges we've got. And I think you then start to get into the much bigger subject about what value we place on food and drink in the UK and what value we place on the, you know, the businesses and the economy supporting that. So I think it gets into a much broader philosophical conversation.
Is it possible to go on being a small producer over the long term? You know, you don't actually want to get much bigger. I mean, is that a viable thing, or is there always this big push to bigger?
I absolutely think it's viable. I wouldn't say that, you know, I would necessarily support an anti-growth agenda, but I think there's a real community benefit in trying to deliver a best business rather than just a big business. So, yeah, I do absolutely think it's viable. And I think all depends on the individual's ambition.
Nigel Murray. Time to meet our last food producer finalist.
In Yale, we have 1 or 2 of these large vaux, as we call them, these long, deep bays. And we have huge exchange of water in the vaux, so we get lovely clean water twice a day. And that makes an ideal environment for shellfish to grow in. Here we're moving past the first of the mussel site. They're long lengths of line on the surface held up with floats. The mussel rocks that the mussels grow on hang below like a curtain down the water underneath them.
Christopher Thomason's family business farms mussels around the Isle of Yell in Shetland. Like all mussel farming, it's a simple process, no chemicals, no environmental damage. Ropes are suspended in the sea, mussels attached to the ropes, and when they're big enough, they get thinned out once and then left to grow. Big at Thomason's. It's a business crucial to life on a remote island. Dan Saladino sailed out with Christopher to check on the shellfish.
If we'd come here 20 years ago, can you just give a sense of the scale and how it's increased?
But we just grew it very gradually over the years, just increased and learned to handle more product and also to build the market. We wash it, grade it, pack it, and it's away on the ferry to Aberdeen that night. So it's between the plate and the sea, it's as close as we can keep it because it is a fresh product.
And supermarkets?
No, we don't touch the supermarkets at all.
And what's the thinking there?
Firstly, we don't have the volume that they look for. Secondly, we're a small business, we're a niche market, and we really don't need supermarkets. They grow a mussel much quicker and a quicker turnaround, but I like to think that if I leave my mussel in the water another year, each one of them reaches their full potential, their full size, and customer gets a bowl of our mussels in a restaurant, they see they're getting something worthwhile, and we know the provenance of it. And we don't have any huge ambitions to expand. I fear if I expand too far, our quality will deteriorate, and I don't want to do that. So we're happy with the market we have.
Was your brother also a fisherman?
No, he worked in the salmon industry before. If you'd come here 25 years ago, it was small family-run salmon farms as we are. Yeah. Much smaller scale. It's owned by big companies now. It's big multinational companies.
Could that happen to the mussel industry?
Yes, I fear it may, and I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. It'll end up in too few hands, but that's just the way things tend to go in business. And we're quite happy to work alongside the bigger farms. It's a necessary market to build the industry. Everything has its place, but we've always been advised our independence is our strongest thing, and we know we have a good product. The customers we have that stuck with us all this time appreciate the product, and we have confidence now in the product we can continue to do this.
Christopher Thomason. In response to Henry Dimbleby's Government Commission National Food Strategy, the government published what it called its own strategy last year. In it was a measure to strengthen localism, consulting on the proposal that at least 50% of the money spent on food in the public sector, schools, hospitals, prisons, etc., must be spent on food produced locally or to higher environmental production standards such as organic. Back at Growing Communities in London, I asked Vicky Hurd what was happening to that proposal.
It's really disappearing rapidly into the distance. I understand that we are expecting these new buying standards to come through any minute now, but they've been watered down to 20% of environment, I think. The local bit, I think, might have disappeared altogether, and maybe all they meant was British anyway, which would be a help in one sense. But, you know, what we really need to do is to have a fresh look at it in the next year so we actually really do embed local and truly environmentally friendly systems.
We're talking to you in the midst of our BBC Food and Farming Awards, and I've been judging the producer category, and we have 3 finalists. All 3 are really seriously involved in feeding people around them. What would happen to people like that in a system if it becomes more and more concentrated?
In a way, we've seen what happens because we've lost many tens of thousands of farms over the last 30 years. What mustn't happen is those kind of wonderful producers that you are giving awards to are further threatened by poor policy in this country. They've got to get that right, and they've got to be protected against imports to lower standards, so the trade deals, we've really got to have better trade policy. I think also if we invest in the kind of infrastructure and retail and supply chains that they can sell to, private or government investment, so that they still have the way to have a diverse option. So they might want to sell to Tesco's a bit, but they also need to be able to sell elsewhere as well, and locally ideally. And those local schemes can support them in harder times, I think.
A final thought from cheesemaker Carrie Rhymes on the future for local food.
We can but just try in our own small way to change things at a very local level. I mean, I've always been one to really encourage and competitors, because I think we need more small-scale people. It needs to slowly evolve, and the more of us there are, the more hopefully the general public will be inspired, and the whole thing then becomes self-perpetuating, and all I can do is to just keep on going and hope that it works.